I've started the recording now. I'll just present the first argument. So, in this debate, we are discussing whether it is. We are discussing the three infinity arguments for the beginning of the universe. The first argument is the impossibility of an infinite regress of events ending. Now, I'll just give two experiments for this. The first example is the dollar example. Suppose I was to give Detroyer a dollar, but I had to ask someone else for that dollar, and they had to ask someone else for that dollar, and they had to ask someone else, and this went on ad infinitum. Would Detroyer ever get that dollar? No, I think this shows an infinite regress of events. Ending is impossible. Now, I'll just give a second thought experiment in this regard because I think it's relevant. Suppose I have an infinite number of ancestors and I'm supposed to receive my inheritance from them. Before I get the inheritance, my father has to get it. Before he gets it, his father has to get it, and before he gets it, his father has to get it, and this goes on and on ad infinitum. In this case, would anyone get the inheritance? No. The reason is very simple. For anyone to get the inheritance, the person before them will always have to get the inheritance, and since there is always a person before, no one will get the inheritance. You can respond.
Okay, good. So yeah, I'll just talk about these two examples, and then I'm going to make before we move on to the second one, the second argument, I'm going to make a kind of general point to frame my problem with these arguments at the outset. So you mentioned, okay, this is for the impossibility of an infinite regress of events ending, and you brought up this dollar example. And as I'm understanding it, suppose the passing of the dollar occurs like once per day or once per minute, or what doesn't matter, right? Let's just go with once per day. And so I say request, and if you have the dollar, get the dollar from you today at noon, say, and you got it from someone else yesterday at noon, and that person got it from someone else the day before that at noon, right? And on the infinite regress, right, we suppose that time does not have a beginning. That just goes on ad infinitum. There's no kind of first person in the sequence. It's just been a beginningless sequence of people requesting and transferring a dollar. And there's nothing, as far as I can tell, incoherent about that. That seems entirely possible to me. There's just this infinite sequence of dollar passings going backward ad infinitum. So, yeah, I've not seen any particular issue with that. And frankly, as long as I'm understanding the inheritance example as being structurally the same, I'm going to say the exact same thing. Right? The person receives inheritance on one day from the previous person, and that person received it from the person before that on the previous day or year or whatever it is. And that seems like an entirely coherent sequence of events extending back toward the infinite past. If you want to come back on that, or do you want me to make my general remark on this, on to kind of frame my problem with these arguments?
I think first I should make a response to that. Then you can choose to either respond or make the general point.
Sure.
Okay, so I'll just make my response on this. I think the main response you gave was in both these cases that if it is happening one at a time, one day at a time, or if there is a regular sequence, uh, then it's possible or impossible. I think you meant impossible, otherwise it's impossible. I could be wrong. But just to clarify this point, I don't think it would be an issue either way. If there is same speed of transference, variable speed, decreasing speed, I don't think that would make a difference, and the reason is very simple. Let's suppose I'm counting right, counting to infinity and even counting down from infinity. The rate at which suppose I get from minus million to minus thousand or minus million to minus 100,000, that does not change anything. I don't see why the rate of this issue has any effect on any of this. And honestly, I would prefer like a response to the argument, but if you're just okay with things as they are, you can make your second point or the general point you wanted to make.
Sure. So I'll just comment on the thing you brought up right now specifically. My giving an example of it occurring once per day at that interval is entirely inconsequential at whatever rate I think is coherent there. Right? So it could be speeding up, slowing down, going up and down. It could be a shorter or longer duration, whatever. And I think they're all coherent and possible. So I don't see any problem, regardless what we say about that. I will say though, on the general point that I was going to make is that in a lot of these discussions, we end up looking at these constructed, scenarios, and then discussing the possibility or impossibility of those. And that can be okay, but remember, this is supposed to be about the possibility of an infinite past simpliciter. And if you think that's impossible, either there should be something impossible just in the supposition alone that there's a vast eternal universe, or that there could be one, or it has to be a consequence of that possibility that the scenario you're describing would be possible, right? Because if it's not, then I could just agree that this scenario you're discussing is impossible and say, yeah, it's not impossible, but so what? The infinite past is possible. What you're describing could not obtain in an infinite past or any world, right? So the general concern is, well, the challenge is this. You have to either show how an infinite past is impossible directly, drive some sort of absurdity in the supposition that there's or could be an infinite past, or show how the possibility of an infinite past entails the possibility of this other allegedly impossible scenario. And rarely in these discussions does either of those get attempted. And well, in the first example, I don't think it actually is an impossibility. But if it were, I would start to question, well, why would that impossibility be a consequence of the possibility of an infinite past? But again, I don't think the infinite sequence of inheritance or dollar passings are impossible.
Should I respond now?
Yeah, you can respond or do whatever you want. Go on to the next point. Or
Okay. So just to get briefly on the earlier examples, again, I would have preferred if there was a response given to the very simple point, especially in the case of the inheritance example. The reason no one in that scenario gets the inheritance, because for anyone to get the inheritance, someone before them has to get the inheritance, and there's always a person before. But if you don't want to if you want to move forward, I'm okay with that as well. Now again,
well,
I
no.
actually
Okay, well, I can comment on that, right? Because I thought I did address that. I think this a necessary condition for the person receiving the inheritance was that the person before it received it, and the necessary condition on them receiving it was the person before it receiving it. And so you could say that the necessary condition on my receiving it, or any person receiving it, is that the infinitely many people before it all received it. But the point is that on the infinite past, or on the view in question, where there's been this infinite history of people receiving it, by the time it comes for me to receive it, everyone else has received it, right? All the necessary conditions have been met, right? So there's no incoherence in supposing that I can now receive my inheritance, because each of the other persons has already received theirs. That's satisfied in this situation, because, well, that's just what's been going on in the history of the infinite world.
I don't remember you making this point before. I could be wrong, but I am happy to address this, and I'm glad actually you did make this point. I think in your scenario that you just described, you are assuming it has happened. You are assuming that all those people have received it. The point I was making, that no one would receive it because the person before them has to receive it, and there is always a person before. That was my point. Now I'll just address your the general point you made, and then you can address either of these. So if I'm not and by the way, first I'll describe your general point so that I'm not straw manning you. You can listen to it, tell me whether I'm correct or not in your understanding your position. So the point you made was, it seemed to me, that you could hold that an infinite past is possible while all of the scenarios I am describing are impossible. And a second point you made was that this argument is of the form that if an infinite past is possible, these things would be possible. These things are not possible, so infinite past is not possible. Are these the 2 points that you made?
So close enough. On the first point, I wouldn't necessarily want to say that all of these scenarios are impossible. I mean, I've just granted that the first ones you mentioned are possible, but it could be that some of them I think are just impossible in their own right. Like suppose I thought that
But you are
Hilbert's
saying,
Hotel was impossible. I don't,
but you are saying these could be impossible, but that doesn't mean the infinite past would be impossible.
Right. I could think that, and maybe we'll come to examples where I do think this, but I'm not going to just lace them out until we get there.
Sure.
I could think that some scenario you describe is impossible. For example, the Grim Reaper scenario. I think that's impossible. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but I think that's impossible. But I reject the inference from if the infinite past is possible, then that would be possible. And in order for you to conclude that the infinite past is possible, you need to support that inference, right? Because otherwise, you can just say that you're right, that scenario is impossible, but the infinite past is possible, and you haven't done anything to undermine that view. Right?
Okay, so I'll try to address this point. Firstly, what do we mean by an infinite past is happening or the universe is past eternal? I think what that clearly means is that a series of past events is infinite. There's an infinite series of past events, an infinite series of changes. I mean, time is change, right? Or change of physical terms, but either way, it is change. There is change taking place. There's an infinite series of changes taking place in an infinite past. Whether I give the inheritance example, or to be honest, I can give dozens of examples like this. For instance, I could change the inheritance to reporting a historical report would be one example. But all of these involve the change, a series of infinite past changes, the same as would be the case in an eternal past. Whether it's identically these changes, not necessarily. There could be other changes, but in either case, there is a series of changes taking place. The next one depends on the previous one, and the previous one depends on the one before that, and the previous one depends on the one before that, and on ad infinitum. This is the exact similarity in all of these, and the problem I think in all of these is that again, for any change to take place, the one before them has to take place. But since every change has a before, as a previous change, no change will be taking place. Also, I think when given enough examples like this, and if someone was to spend, for instance, an hour thinking about this, I bet they could come up with 6 or 7 examples. More time, they could come up with even more examples like this. When there are so many examples like this, I think it would be turned into a case of special pleading, where all of these infinite past scenarios are impossible, but maybe, just maybe, there is one infinite past scenario that's possible. So I think it would turn into a case of special pleading. You can respond to this, and I think then we should go on to the second argument.
Yeah, so I just want to make three quick points. The first thing you brought up was, well, what does it mean to say that she's an infinite past? Well, I mean something like this. Past time consists of an infinite sequence of non-overlapping temporal intervals of equal duration. Something like that. So there could be infinitely many days, many seconds, whatever, that are non-overlapping at all past. Now, you brought up some point about, well, okay, but time is change, or maybe time is grounded by change in some way. Right? You need to have change in order to have time. I have no problem granting that. I think there's some complications there regarding the philosophy of time, but it's relevant to our discussion here. I'll grant that in order to have time or progressing, you need to have changes. Okay, and then the second thing, you sort of turned this into another version of the cases that you brought up already, but it was meant to be entirely general, and apparently ostensibly derivable from the supposition that this is the past, which is that, look, in order to have some change, you have to have the change before it, and then have the change before that, and that change, you need to have to change before that, and so on and so on and so on. But the problem is, on your view, that because each of them has a change before it that would have to obtain for it to obtain, then the present one cannot obtain. Again, I think that's just logical error, right? On the view, the change occurred today because all of the changes prior today did occur, right? The change yesterday occurred, the change before that day occurred, and so on for all of the changes at all of the times, right? They occurred. Now you could say that, well, I'm assuming that they occurred. Well, yes, because this is the model that we're considering. If there's an incoherence in this model, then you can point that out. But just pointing out that I'm assuming something that's part of the model in order to explain how the other part of the model could obtain, does nothing to show that there's a problem with the model. Right? The model is consistent. So again, yes, the change today occurred, and here I'm just granting the metaphysics of change here, which I actually would not grant in general, but I'm granting it for sake of making the logical point, which is that the change occurred today, in part because the change did occur yesterday, and in part because the change the day before that occurred, and so on and so on and so on. All of those changes did occur, and that's just part of the model. Right? And that's a coherent model, and nothing you said, I think, undermines that, either in this case regarding changes or in the cases regarding the inheritance or the dollar. I'm able to receive the dollar, I'm able to receive the inheritance because all the changes did occur, and that's just part of the model in question. And just quickly on the third thing, regarding the sort of challenge that I'm proposing, it's supposed to be, you're supposed to be showing some sort of problem, either a logical or some sort of metaphysical problem or absurdity in the supposition of an infinite past. And the way to do that, as far as I can ascertain, is to either show directly that there's some problem with the infinite past, right? Maybe it entails a contradiction or is is problematic internally for some reason, or show that it entails the possibility of something else, which is problematic in one of those ways, right? So it entails like some other impossible scenario. And you point out, well, but I can just keep multiplying these examples of scenarios and it would be a sort of special pleading to suppose that the infinite past would be possible or something like that. No, it would not be, right? Because again, you could multiply a billion different paradoxes, right, or impossible scenarios, and I could grant that those are impossible scenarios, but that their possibility with us doesn't follow from the possibility of an infinite past. Again, like this comes up in the Grim Reaper paradox, which I'm very familiar with, and actually I have a paper in review on that. And it requires this linking premise from the possibility of the infinite past to the possibly. Well, whatever. I'm just rambling at this point. We can come back on. You can come back on that, or we can.
Yeah, because then we would be dealing with too many points at once.
Yes. Yeah. Fair enough.
Okay. So I'll just address these points, and then you can choose whether you want to respond further on this, or should I move to the next point. I'll just address these a bit.
Sure.
Okay, so the 2 points that I am interested in addressing that you have made so far were basically the point that the point of special pleading, and I think your second point was that in these scenarios it is possible. I'll just put it in a different way. You are saying that in the case of the inheritance example, because I am receiving the inheritance because the person before me has received it. And my response was that you're assuming it's possible, and your response to this was that that is the nature of the example. I have to disagree in this regard. That's not the nature of this example, because I think the example was clearly showing that for the same reason I'm not getting it, it's the same reason my father's not getting it. In the example itself, my father is not receiving the inheritance, or the person before him is not receiving the inheritance. You said that in the example they were, but I don't think so. The example itself is not showing that. In fact, they are not receiving the inheritance for the same reason everyone else is not receiving the inheritance. For them to get the inheritance, the person before them has to get the inheritance, and since there is always a person before, they won't get the inheritance. This was just respond to that point. Second was the case of special pleading. You said that you can get that I can multiply these examples, and basically if they are all problematic, you can or basically if they all of them can still be impossible, and yet the infinite past can still be possible. I have to disagree on this for a very simple reason. Again, whether it's the example of inheritance, or narrating a historical report, or any other simple example in an infinite past, something like this will always be happening. Change, the next change is dependent on the previous change, and the change that change is dependent on the one before that, and on ad infinitum. This problem is not going away, and in the infinite past, exactly this problem will be the issue. This is the same in all of these scenarios. So I don't think that the problem is going away. And if you say that all of these are impossible, but an infinite past in some sense or in some way might be possible, I think that's just special pleading, and I think we will disagree on this. If you want, you can respond to this, and if not, I can move to the second argument.
Yeah, all right. I mean, I have to comment on the first one because, I mean, and this is something you keep saying that there's some problem here, but I'm denying that there's any problem in any of the cases. So, and the reason is this. Of course, we could have infinite past where, you know, in order for you to receive your inheritance now, someone has to receive it in the past, and nobody did receive it in the past, right? Okay, then you don't receive the inheritance now. I think that's a possibility. But a possible model or possible way things could have played out, I think, is that you did receive the inheritance now. Your father did receive it, you know, at some point in the past. His father didn't receive it at some point in the past, and so on ad infinitum. And the point is that you can receive it now because the necessary and sufficient condition for you now receiving it has been met. Each person in the past has received it.
Friction, I didn't understand.
That's a coherent model. If you think there's some incoherence in that model, I haven't heard it.
Friction, I did not understand the thing you were saying earlier. Did you say that I am receiving the inheritance despite my father not receiving it or receiving it? I didn't hear that. Can you just repeat it?
No. Sorry. So I've just described two coherent scenarios. In one of them, like, nobody receives it, right? I mean, that's possible, right? You have this infinite sequence where nobody receives their inheritance. But I don't think that's required. Another possibility is that everybody in the sequence does. And the reason you can receive it now, and this generalizes to each person in the sequence, is that each of the people prior to them in the sequence did receive it at their respective time. And you could say, well, but they can't because what? I haven't heard any reason to doubt the coherence of this model. Right? Each person does receive it at their time in the same way that each person could be clapping their hands at their time. There's nothing incoherent about
that. Just to respond to this, I think there is something incoherent, and I think I've explained why that is. But to be honest, I think if we keep discussing this, the entire debate will be me asserting it's incoherent and you asserting it's coherent, because we have already discussed our arguments. So I think we should go to the second argument now.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so the second argument is from the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite. Here's the basically what I'm saying in this scenario is that in the case of an infinite series of past events ending today is analogous to someone always counting down from negative infinity to basically ending at zero. Now there is no starting point in this case because the person is always counting. I think that's impossible, and I'll just give a very simple reason why. Let's suppose that a particular person has always been counting all the negative numbers, right? And he ends today. Why is he ending at today instead of yesterday or the day before that? Because at any point in the past, he has already counted an infinite number of numbers. There is absolutely no explanation why that person is ending today instead of yesterday, and I think this basically violates strong version of the PSR or even the weak version because there is no partial explanation here. So I think that's impossible because there is absolutely no explanation, not even a partial explanation for the PSR. And I do think the strong PSR is self-evidently true, but this argument does not require a strong PSR. It will work even on the weak PSR. You can respond to this and.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So, I mean, some of the remarks I'm going to make, people might maybe you're familiar. There's a paper from Wes Morrison called. I wanted to say Infinity Time and Successive Addition, but I think that's not his paper. But whatever. Wes Morrison has a paper from 2020 where he makes some remarks on this. I'll talk about the PSRs in a second because I reject all of them. I think they're all logical falsehoods, but that's we can get into that if we want to. And so maybe you're familiar with some of the things I'm going to say, but let me just get through it. Okay, so whether the count, whether the fact that the count ends today rather than some other day, like yesterday or a billion years from now, or whatever, whether that can be wholly explainable depends partly on what we're kind of counting as an explanation, what can count as an explanation here, and also potentially on some things regarding the ontology of time, relationism, substantivalism. I'm not going to get into that. So, some view, at least a partial explanation of why the count ends today would appeal to facts about, which numbers were counted on which past days and what sort of count is being done. And that, for example, we counted 0 today because it counted, 1 yesterday and was counting down, or -1 yesterday and was counting up the negative integers. However, you might point out, and this is fair to bring this up, okay, but what about the explanation for why the whole count is the way that it is, rather than, say, like shifted forward or backwards relative to other events? And so, for example, why wasn't it an infinite count on which, say, -10 was counted today, and -11 was counted yesterday, and -12 the day before that, and so on? We can generalize to each of the days. And if we cannot sort of appeal to or adduce relational temporal facts as part of our explanation here, then I'm not sure in principle what sort of explanation there could be for a fact of this sort. Perhaps there couldn't be one. I'm not so worried either way. I would argue that this generalizes to finite counts as well, explanations of which will still run out, so to speak, even if the sequence had a beginning. And I could talk about that, but it's actually not really relevant to my point because I have no issue granting that, and actually would assert that infinite counts would be root in at least certain respects. And as such, I see no reason to reject that possibility. Now, for this, it's going to turn into a discussion on PSRs, strong, weak, whatever. I think I haven't heard one that I accept. I reject almost all of them. All the ones that I've heard. So we can have a discussion on that, or not, because I feel like that's going to take us afield. But yeah, comment on that.
Yeah, Detroit came at the end, but are you familiar with the distinction Kant gives between a totem analyticum and a totem syntheticum when it comes to time?
This is supposed to be a 1v1 discussion.
Makes it possible, whereas a totem syntheticum doesn't.
Nicolot, this is supposed to be a 1v1 discussion.
Oh, my mistake. I didn't know that.
Oh, I have him muted. Like I should not be. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, what a douche.
Just mute him. It's fine. You can right click and mute. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have bang perms, so otherwise I would. Because it's a waste.
Can I just respond now?
Yes, yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So, basically, as far as the PSR is concerned, I think that's self-evidently true, and if you like, we can discuss some of that. But here's the claim I'm making for this debate, and I'll just restrict myself to this particular question. In the case of why it's ending today instead of yesterday, or in this case, there is at least something that has no explanation and not even a partial explanation. Here is why. So the answer given from you, and I heard Malpa say this as well, the reason it's ending today because it was at -10 yesterday. I don't think this explains anything for for a very simple reason. If you can put one particular point at its place, if you can identify -100, -10, -million, you will identify all the points. But there's you will identify when it comes to 0, comes to -10, you will identify all the points by just identifying one thing. So I don't think this is an explanation of that, but there's an even bigger problem here. Why? I can ask the question, why are the numbers at their particular positions? In this case, there is no possible explanation in this regard. I don't think anyone has given one. I don't think anyone has even tried to give in this regard an explanation of why the numbers are at their particular position. There is none. So there is not even a partial explanation for this. And if someone has it, I would love to hear it, but there simply isn't one, at least in my experience, from what I've heard from atheists. Now, as far as the PSR is concerned, right? Of course, we can take different first principles in this regard. You can basically assume that brute contingencies can exist. I can assume they can't exist, right? We could have different perspectives, and we could come in with different presuppositions. But I think there is a problem here, and it is with regards to burden of proof. And what I want to know, what is your position, or the position atheists would like to take with regards to the burden of proof in case of possibility and impossibility. Does possibility need to be proven? Does impossibility need to be proven, or both need to be proven? And here's why this is relevant. If impossibility only needs to be proven, right, then there's a problem for atheists because of the S5 axiom and the modal ontological argument, where basically it is assumed existence of God is possible. If that's the case, right, atheists would have to prove existence of God is impossible. If impossibility needs to be proven, that is. If possibility needs to be proven, on the other hand, I think atheists would have to give some evidence with regards to uh, something coming from nothing being possible, or brute contingencies being possible, or infinite actual infinities existing being possible. Either way, either the whatever the option atheist takes, whether possibility needs to be proven, whether impossibility needs to be proven, or both need to be proven, I don't think there is any way around some burden of proof for the atheist in either position, and I don't think that problem is going away. You can respond.
Yeah, so I think that's all wrong. However, I have no problem taking on the burden of showing that it's possible. It just would require a bit of a longer discussion about how I think about modality and the different, or this particular modalities that we might have in consideration. So, for example, if we're considering a logical modality, right, something that modality which respects certain logical principles, perhaps like non-contradiction, certain consequence relations, and so on, then something is logically possible just in case it doesn't violate those principles or those axioms. Right? It's compatible, so to speak, with the axioms and consequence relations of that system. And on my view, although not everyone shares this, this generalizes. This is just how it is for different modalities. It's just that on different modalities, we're holding different things fixed, and we have different potential consequence relations. So you can get different modal truths, quote unquote, on different modalities. So, for example, something could be nomologically possible, even nomologically impossible, even if it's logically possible, or something can be conceptually impossible, even though it's logically possible, and so on. And for metaphysical possibility, that's a bit trickier. I have some proposals of how I would kind of want to think about that, what sort of things we're importing as the axioms or the metaphysical laws there, so to speak, constraining the space. But I don't really want to get into the details here, unless that's the modality in which we're assessing the possibility or impossibility of these things. In which case, yeah, I would want to make those things explicit so that I could try to derive whether it's a possibility or impossibility. At the very least, for a logical possibility, it's quite easy to show that the claim that there's an infinite past or could be an infinite past is a logical possibility, because there's no contradiction in the statement, right? No matter how we formalize it. And you can just do a truth table and see whether the thing is satisfiable. And that's what I would do, but with some complications for any modality that we consider, so long as we have sufficient details of the modality on the table, which is not always the case, but that's why I go into that further discussion on modality. Regarding, I don't really want to make this a discussion about S5 and the modal ontological argument, but of course I would say the same thing there. I think that depending on which modality you have in mind, I think the existence of a God defined that way is a logical falsehood. That's just not true on logical modality, but any modality where the axioms do not entail the existence of that thing. And of course, I'm not going to accept the axioms of any modality where they do entail the existence of that thing. So I actually think these modal arguments get us nowhere. Right? They either involve an axiom set which I reject, or they in fact don't entail the existence of the thing, and so in fact entail its non-existence. And you can just show that quite simple as a straightforward logical deduction. And so supporting the impossibility of this thing is actually rather trivial affair for a modality in which its existence is not entailed from the axioms. But that's, neither here nor there. Of course, I could take the view that God doesn't exist, and maybe I could even take the view that God is impossible, but I might not have a way to support that. So what? That doesn't bear on the present discussion. If we're arguing whether sets in church is these infinite sequences are possible. Maybe I have reason to think that they're possible. Maybe I don't, or maybe I'm just objecting to the reasons to think that they're impossible. But actually, for my purposes, I'm happy to go through positive cases for thinking that they are possible, merely from this analysis of the modalities in question. But and just one more thing quickly on the PSR. Actually, I would say that that's a logical falsehood as well. So, and this is a kind of complicated point, but I think that for a PSR which is meant to explain all facts, including the contrastive facts, I think it rules out any contingency on for any modality in terms of which it's defined, right? And for any of the modalities in question, I think there is contingency as a matter of logical fact, and so the PSR in question is ruled out as a matter of logical fact. This is a kind of complicated point, and would take some time to get through and explain why I think it just follows. I just rule out these. I think these principles can be ruled out a priori, just like as a matter of straightforward logic. But it's complicated, and I think sort of off to the side. As far as I'm concerned, I don't accept it, and so I'm not going to sort of accept it as a demonstration that these things are impossible.
Okay, I'll respond to these points now, and you can choose to respond then or move to the next argument. So I think you, in this particular discussion, at least in basically the last time, this whole time you were speaking, you did not address the point about the infinite, like, or there be no explanation for why each number is at their particular place. But I'm okay with that. Now, as far as I can remember, I don't remember you answering the point of.
But hang on. Sorry, that's in my initial reply. I talked about that, right? That's what I mentioned. I even brought up. Well, you could reply. What's the explanation for the fact that the whole kind of sequence, as it were, is at the location that it is, right? Why was negative 10
or why any number is
yesterday, or why was negative 11 the day before that, and so on for each of them, right? And I said it might turn out that that's the sort of thing that is brute. There might not be any kind of further explanation for that so doesn't appeal to the
no explanation here.
Temporal relations. Okay.
Yeah, we agree there is no explanation here.
Okay. Yeah, although I think that the bruteness there is general, right? That is going to be present for the finite counts as well. But I mean, we could. But I mean, because I think bruteness invades everything, right? So I don't think there's going to be a way to get around bruteness here or there.
Can I just respond to your
point? But I mean, that's a further discussion. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. I've been talking a lot.
Okay. And you can respond to this later, but I think in the case of finite points where they are at their particular position, there is an explanation. It's because there was a particular beginning, and when that beginning took place, that determines why each point is at their position. So in case of finite regresses or finite countdowns, there is an explanation. I would just say this, and now I want to go on to the second point regarding the basically point I made with regards to the burden of proof. Here is why that is relevant. I don't think you answered the question that where lies the burden of proof? Does possibility need to be proven? Does impossibility need to be proven, or both need to be proven? If you don't have a fixed position on this, I think you're just cherry picking what you want other side to prove. And if you are not basically proving anything, any of your beliefs, or you have no justification for your beliefs, I think you're just taking them on blind faith. This is why it is important to have a consistent standard. Does possibility need to be proven? Does impossibility need to be proven, or both? Because either way, there are things that atheists cannot prove or even try to prove. With regards to infinity, just to give one minor example, right? The basically claim is that mathematics somehow proves infinity, actual infinities are possible. I think this is categorically false. Why? Because all mathematics shows is that there is no logical contradictions in it. Here is the problem for atheists. There are no logical contradictions in God either. The problem of evil does not prove a logical contradiction, right? Most atheist philosophers will agree to this. There are no logical contradictions in God. So if you are restricting possibility to just whether there are logical contradictions or not, existence of God is possible. If it is possible, then according to the S5 axiom, God does exist and atheism is false then. So, unless you can reject the S5 axiom, but I don't think most atheist philosophers will do that for obvious reasons. But either way, I don't think you're getting away with this problem. As far as the PSR is concerned, I think you mentioned there are logical contradictions, and in here, and from what I could tell, the claim was basically everything is necessary or the model collapse argument, right? Here's why I think that is wrong. The assumption is a necessary fact or a necessary being or a necessary thing cannot cause a contingent fact. I think that's just false. A necessary being or cause or whatever can have a will and can choose to bring a particular contingent fact into existence. So I think the model collapse does not work, and the other common contentions to the PSR don't work for the same reason, for similar reasons either. And if you want, we can go into them, but maybe we can have a second discussion later on that specifically focuses on PSR. Now, you can respond to what I said, or I can just move to the third infinity argument.
Yeah, no, I have to respond because there's three things here, and I'll take them in reverse order. Just quickly on the modal collapse. That's not the argument I was making at all. That's just something totally different. Right. So, and I would agree with you. Right. These concerns from a necessary being causing or potentially explaining certain things. Some people allege that results in modal collapse. I agree with you. I don't think that does. I do think that a PSR with a certain modal robustness that get into does entail modal collapse, right? And I gave the kind of, I didn't really get into it, but there's a kind of relatively straightforward argument that I make in support of that. That would take some time to get into, though. We can get into that if you want to, or we could save that for another time. But I do think that the PSR leads to the modal collapse for the modality in terms of which it is defined, even if a necessary being creating things doesn't entail modal collapse. Okay. And then the second thing about burden of proof, you asked this question of what would the person alleging possibility or impossibility need to support? It depends on in what context we're discussing this need to here. In the discussion of kind of debate where one side says it is possible and one side says it isn't possible, one side says it's impossible, then both of them have sort of taken on a burden to themselves in that discussion, in that debate, to support their possibility or impossibility claim. In general, though, outside of a kind of debate context where there's certain norms of discourse or support like that, that might not be an expectation of a person to support a belief that they have. What I'm saying, for the purposes, for at least for my purposes, I'm happy to provide support for my possibility claims. I've done a little bit of that. Most of it has been discussing the success of these arguments, right, for the impossibility claim, which, again, that was sort of the main topic of our discussion. It wasn't, I'm claiming they're impossible, you're claiming they're impossible. It was, do these arguments for the impossibility succeed, right? That was kind of the target. But again, I'm happy to take on a stronger burden than showing that they don't succeed. And then just quickly on the first thing, I forget if there was something else I wanted to cover, but the first thing where you said
I think the first thing was
this
that...
Person's really... Okay.
I think the first thing was that there is no explanation for
the finite count would be explained. Yeah. I don't think that explains it at all, right? Or at least it's appealing to the same sort of explanation that you're declining the person to appeal to in the infinite case, right? You said, why does each of them occur on the day that they occur? Well, you said because there's a first one, and that occurred 100 days ago, say in a 100-day count. That is just the sort of fact that we're not allowed to appeal to in this for explaining this fact, right? Because after all, if I can appeal to some of the facts, some of the counts in my sequence, then I can explain it in the same way, right? Because after all, a finite pass is coherent is consistent with a count of down from 100 having occurred 1,000 years ago, or 2 years ago, or 100 days ago, right? And just pointing out that if you're just going to say that, it began on this time, right? Then you're just giving the sort of information, right? You're importing the sort of facts that I'm not allowed to appeal to in the case of the infinite one, but for some reason you're allowed to appeal to in the case of this finite one. There's not a symmetry there. We can get into more of that, but the point is that I think if we restrict ourselves from appealing to the same class of facts and explaining this fact in question, then we're both going to be in the same boat of lacking explanatory robustness. But yeah, I don't know if you can come back on that or just or go on to the third one. It's up to you.
Yeah, I will prefer to come back on those, and I'll just make it brief. Now, as for the first point, you said that in the case of basically finite counts, that it began then does not explain why the points are at their particular positions, and that this sort of explanation is not granted to in the case of infinite countdowns. Of course, it isn't. In the case of infinite countdowns, there is no beginning. Like yes, remind us again and again, in the case of a finite countdown, there is a beginning. Now, why that countdown began? Because that person chose to begin that for one reason or another. I think it would go into that, but there is an explanation, and this explanation cannot be in the case of infinite cases by definition, because in those cases there is no beginning. As for the second point, again,
whoever's making noises, just stop.
In the case of the second point you made.
Yes, Sasha.
This is a one-on-one discussion, please.
In the
sounds very interesting. That's true.
It's just a one-on-one discussion, right? Just that happened. I don't think we have a lot of time left. Just let us finish it up. As for the as for the second point, I think your second point was that was regarding the possibility, or that you don't need to have a fixed position, or you can choose to take a stronger burden, right? If you are choosing to take a stronger burden for
not exactly.
Can you just briefly repeat it?
Oh yeah. Well, so the burden here, I take burden of proof as a kind of dialectical thing, right? So it's a burden is something someone can like take on in a discussion or a debate, right? It's not just like standing burdens that people have, I don't think, in general, right? So like if I'm arguing for a certain position, then I'm taking on some sort of burden to support that position. And so if you take on a certain position and so on. Of course, I could just have some other view that I haven't taken on as like as something that I'm arguing for, and in the course of a certain discussion or debate may not have any burden to support that, unless it's in service of something that I do have a burden to support.
Okay.
But for the purposes of our discussion, I'm happy to, not only argue against the success of these arguments for against the infinite past, which was the actual debate discussion, I'm willing to take on the burden of arguing for the possibility of the infinite past.
Okay, I'll respond to this. So it seems to me, in the case of the three options I mentioned, you are choosing the one that both possibility and impossibility need to be proven, at least in a debate context. I think it is impossible.
No, not exactly. In a debate where one side is supporting the view that they're impossible and the other side is supporting the view that they're possible, then yeah, they've taken on those burdens. Actually, I don't think that was the burdens taken on in this debate, right? Because again, this was about the success of these arguments against the infinite past. And all I have to show is that the arguments don't succeed. I don't have to show that in fact is the possibility of an infinite past. But again, I'm happy to take on that burden as well.
Okay.
Well, it's at least conceivable.
Please stop. I just one.
This is just a one-on-one discussion. Okay. As far as in this regard, right? In terms of what a person believes, I think there needs to be a standard, because if you don't have a standard, you're just cherry picking and taking your beliefs on faith, essentially. If you don't have a standard, if you just change your position regards to possibility and impossibility whenever you feel like it, I think you end up just taking things on blind faith. This is why I think there is a standard that is important. Now, uh, and again, I think we will disagree on this, and I think I've explained why I think there needs to be a standard in this regard. Now, you said that you are happy to take the burden for it, to prove that infinites are possible, right? Uh, Okay, I would like to hear something for that, some justification for that, but just to make a brief point here, the explanation usually given by atheists is that mathematics shows that infinity is possible, that Cantor has proven these things. But all Cantor has proven is that there are no logical contradictions in this. That criteria can be applied to God as well. There are no logical contradictions in God. The problem of evil doesn't prove a logical contradiction, neither do any of the atheist arguments. Other atheist arguments prove a logical contradiction. So, existence of God is possible, and if that's possible by the S5 axiom, God does exist. So, I don't think that problem is going away. You can respond to this, and then I'll just actually, you know what? I won't go to the like in detail on the final Kalam argument because, to be honest, I was planning on sticking for just an hour. I think it's been more than that, or just about an hour. Uh, you can
Well,
respond
so
to
it's up
this,
to you
and
because I do want to. I can go quickly on that, and we can sort of finish around there, and maybe just some closing remarks. Or if you want to quickly go into the last one, it's up to you. But I'll just say some quick things on the things that you brought up. So I don't remember if I said anything on this already, but on the ontological argument in particular, if the claim in question is that God exists, where God is defined as a being which is, say, logically necessary, then I actually think there is going to be a logical contradiction in the claim that there is this thing of that sort. In fact, it entails its truth entails that something is a logical truth when it isn't, and that turns into a logical falsehood. And that generalizes across different modalities, except for modalities on which I won't accept the axioms, right? One which in fact do entail existence of that thing of that sort. I think I already mentioned this. This is a somewhat complicated technical point, and I'm kind of rushing through it, so it's...
Friction, can you just repeat what you said for the last 20 seconds? I think you maybe I didn't hear it correctly.
Yeah.
Can you just repeat?
It's fine, because this is a somewhat complicated technical point, and it's hard for me to expand on in a simple way. So God is understood as a being which is, if he exists necessarily, right? Okay, well, necessarily in what sense? If it's in the logical sense, I think there is a logical contradiction. Literally a logical contradiction in the supposition that there is a being of that sort, and I can derive it, right? If it's not in the logical sense in which it's supposed to exist necessarily, then whether there is a logical contradiction in the supposition that it exists on that, given the modality in question, will depend on the details of the modality in question. Either it will be, in which case I'll say the same thing, there is a logical contradiction entailed by the supposition that exists, or it will not be, but then actually I'm not going to accept the sort of things held fixed in that modality, because that modality is actually going to include as axioms or as like laws or things held fixed, stuff which entails the existence of a being of this sort, and I obviously don't accept that.
Friction,
but yeah,
I'm sorry for interrupting you.
Friction? But actually, this is sort of relevant, right? Because this was all made in service of your point that, well, if you
understand, Friction, just a minor point. Yeah. You said that you could show a logical contradiction in God or derive it. Can you do that, please?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the basic idea, if the idea is that God is, if he exists, a being which exists of logical necessity, right? If something exists of logical necessity, right, then its existence follows from the axioms of logic, and given the consequence relations of logic. However, the existence of a God does not so follow, right? So we have something which, if true, entails something false, right? That's a contradiction, right? And I can spell this out in more detail, but yeah, the existence of a God of the sort would entail that its existence follows from the axioms of logic. Existence not follows from the axioms of logic, so it entails something false, and so it's false. That's the basic idea. That's the basic structure of the proof. Explaining that or writing it out in more detail would take a few more minutes.
But you said that, but you did not give any evidence for it being impossible, right? You were saying that you could show there is a logical contradiction. None of the atheist arguments.
That's right. That's what I was. That's the argument that I'm just making. that it's a logical contradiction that follows.
I don't think you have shown.
And so it's impossible, at least in the logical sense.
I don't think you have shown any logical contradiction. If you want, you can clarify this, or if you want, we can move on.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm happy to sort of repeat it briefly because, again, getting to the detail here is just more into the weeds. So again, this is sort of irrelevant to the present discussion. But the basic idea of the proof, where I'm deriving the contradiction, is that, okay, we have something, the claim is that there exists a God, where God is, if there does exist a God, it exists necessity. Okay? Now, something necessary cannot entail something false. In fact, if something entails something false, it's necessarily false, right? And I'm claiming is that the existence of God does entail something false, right? And so it's necessarily false. And what it entails that's false is that the existence of a being of that sort follows from the axioms of logic, given the consequence relations of logic, and it doesn't. That's false, right? So because the existence of God, the claim that a God exists, entails something false, it's impossible. It's logically impossible. It's logically inconsistent, right? And you can just show if something entails something false, that's just how you, in logic, that's how that would be like a sort of reductio ad absurdum. That's,
Fiction, it seems to me.
In fact, that's how you do a proof by contradiction.
You're just saying it's false because it's false. I mean.
No, because it entails something false.
What is it? Does it entail that is false?
It entails that the axioms and consequence relations of logic entail the existence of this being.
The axioms
By the way,
and principles of
logic. What I said here of logic entail the existence of this being. What I said here was specific to the claim that a God exists, which is logically necessary. You don't have to be making the claim that it's logically necessary. I made remarks which would generalize to different modalities, right? On some other modality, it might be the same thing, or it might be the case that it's not ruled out in this way, but then I'm actually going to reject the axioms of that system. And so actually, we don't make any progress here. Either it is going to be a contradiction to suppose it exists in this sense, or it isn't, but then I'm still going to reject its existence because it rests on axioms which I reject.
Friction, just to respond to this point, you said that it's false because there are axioms that entail God's existence, but those axioms don't do that. As far as I can tell, the only axiom I brought is the S5, which says if it's possible that God exists, then God does exist. But you're just saying that's not true. You can reject the axiom, but you have not given me any reason to say that existence of God is possible. You can reject the axiom, you can take it as false.
No.
But you're just not giving any reason for existence of God being impossible. And
so first of all, what you said there is not S5. That's a consequence of S5. S5 is a system of which that's a consequence relation.
Yeah, I agree with the consequence of S5.
But I'm not rejecting S5. What I said was the axioms of logic. So look, I sort of went into this briefly earlier, and again, I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this because I'd like to kind of wrap up the actual discussion rather than discussing on the ontological argument. But what I said earlier about whether something is logically possible or logically impossible has to do with whether it's compatible with the axioms of logic, right? That's going to include things like, the law of non-contradiction and, modus ponens is a consequence relation and sort of other things that are taken to be logical truths. I mean, we can quibble over what exactly we're including there, but, predicate logic, first order logic, whatever. We're fine taking some logic like that. And what I'm saying is that if something is logically possible in this sense, if something is claimed to exist of logical necessity, right, it's part of what it means to be a thing of this sort is that it exists of logical necessity, then I think there is a contradiction entailed by supposing that a thing of that sort exists. And because you can derive from the statement that thing exists that it's a consequence of the axioms of logic, given the logical consequence relations, that this thing exists. It's not. So you have something, the claim that this thing exists entails something false, and so it doesn't exist.
What is the false thing that this entails?
You can show that the claim that exists is in fact a contradiction, because anything that's not a contradiction does not entail something false.
Friction, again,
Yes,
What's the contradiction here?
Well, I
And
would want to qualify that slightly, but yeah.
what's the
Sorry?
contradiction here? And again, I'm not seeing an argument for why existence of God is impossible. You are just saying because axioms contradicted. Which axiom contradicts it? At least give some
I
explanation
didn't
why
say
it's
that.
impossible.
Yeah, so it could be that you're just not tracking the sort of logical structure of the argument here. Maybe we better if I ever sort of wrote it out.
I'll just make
sure.
one point, right?
I could go through it again.
I'll just make one point and then we can go to the closing remarks, each of us. Right?
Sure. I mean, if you want to have a discussion another time on PSRs and ontological arguments, I feel like that would probably be better saved for that than discussion on infinite past.
Yeah, actually, I would love to. But there's a reason I brought up the S5, and actually, I did not particularly make the ontological argument. The reason I brought it up, and the reason I think it was relevant for this discussion, is because of the burden of proof with regards to possibility and impossibility. I think, and we disagree on this, but I still think, and I think it's rational to think, that there should be a standard in this regard. Either possibility needs to be proven, impossibility needs to be proven, or both need to be proven. If the position that atheists take, that impossibility needs to be proven, which I would say that because they're saying infinite regresses are possible without trying to justify it, or something coming from nothing is possible without justifying it, then again, then I think they should at least stick to it. If they are saying impossibility needs to be proven, then they will have the burden of proof with regards to the existence of God. Because if you are following the S5 axiom, if you are accepting it, you have to show or give reasons for believing that it is impossible. Now we can disagree on that, but I think the atheist position would still be inconsistent because of this. I think we should go to the closing remarks now, and let's just keep it at 1 minute each, because
Let me just say something. Let me just say something really quick as a sort of reference for this sort of argument that I'm making.
Sure.
J. Sobel makes basically the same point in his book Logic and Theism. He discusses the examples of like dragoons and whatever. And that's how you get a contradiction, whatever. I'm basically taking the same point. I might not be expressing it in the most understandable way, but yeah. I don't know if you want me to start with closing or you go first. It's up to you.
Since I made the opening statement, I think I should like make the closing at first as well, and we can just both make it brief. So in conclusion, I think the debate was certainly interesting, and I think we did not interrupt each other a lot, and both sides were at least able to make their case clearly. So I did like that. I actually enjoyed the fact that the philosophy side of this and the common philosophical references actually were discussed. That did not happen in my last debate. That did happen in this. So I'm glad for that. Uh, I think my points were clear cut. I don't think again I don't think any response was given to the first argument, as first argument for beginning of the universe. As for the second, again we I think we sort of agreed that there is no explanation. The only response was that finite cases have this problem as well, but I think I refuted that as well. Uh, Again, the last part of the discussion regarding burden of proof and ontological argument PSR was self-explanatory, and probably we will have a second debate on that, inshallah. Friction, you can make your closing statement.
Yeah, I mean, sure, that was a cordial and decent discussion. I'll just summarize my conclusion from the different segments. On the first argument, yeah, I didn't think any good case was made there. There was no incoherence in the model, according to which I received inheritance today, the person before received it yesterday, the person before received it the day before, and so on, for a full specification of each person, of the infinite people and the infinite past. Why is this coherent? Well, the necessary conditions for each person receiving their inheritance on this model are met at their time to receive the inheritance. That is, each person before them received it. And so no problem was raised for this model, as far as I could tell. On the second issue regarding explaining the why an infinite count terminated on some day rather than another, why the whole count was sort of located where it was in time rather than somewhere else. I granted that in some sense there's going to be a lack of explanation for this. I did hint at how actually this might follow just from certain views at that time. Like, for example, Morton made this claim that Craig might fall into this trap. But and I did make the point that I don't think that as a problem, so to speak. I think there are root facts sort of all over the place, and I think there has to be. And I do think there's going to be root facts in the case of a finite count as well. We didn't really go into this. You attempted to say something about, well, but there's a further explanation for why the person, decided to count there. But actually, this is going to result in that's not going to be fully explained either. They're going to do the same thing if you come back to the absolute beginning. We still might. That's why it would then rather than smarter time. Anyway, I don't want to get into that too much. At the very least, there's no incoherence in supposing that there is an infinite past, and there's no complete explanation for why it ended today rather than some other day. Gabriel, could you please mute? And then I guess that was mostly it. Beyond that, we discussed some burden of proof and ontological argument stuff. On the burden of proof thing, yeah, I'm happy to take on certain burdens. I might not take on, as a matter of particular discussions, a burden of proof for all the things I in fact believe. Right, I might believe something, but not be willing to take on a burden to prove it in a particular discussion. For the purpose of this debate, the explicit burdens were arguing for and arguing against the success of these arguments against infinite past. I think I did a decent job sort of undermining those arguments. But for the sake of discussion, I was willing to, although we didn't really get into this very deeply, I was willing to take on a stronger burden, which was that not only do these arguments not succeed in showing that they're impossible, but that they are in fact possible. Right? That I would be willing to take that burden as well. But it's not demanded by the debate or by any more general kind of dialectical norms. And then just quickly on the PSRs and ontological arguments, I know the ontological argument was brought up as a kind of point that, like, well, if you think that you don't have to support impossibilities, but you think that God doesn't exist and God not existing entails a God of the impossible, then you should have to support that God is impossible in order to support you claiming God doesn't exist. And if I'm taking on that burden, or if I have the belief that God doesn't exist, as I do, I am willing to do that, and I'm willing to claim and to support that God not existing is impossible. In fact, a contradiction, if defined in the way that he was defined. Of course, if God is not supposed to be a necessary being, then it might not be a contradiction in supposing that he exists. But if he is, and the modality is something like logical, then I think a contradiction can be derived. I gave the basic argument. It was a little bit confusing, perhaps, but that could be explored at another time. Regardless, it's not that relevant to the success of the arguments against the infinite past, which I think could have universally came up short. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll end the recording.